All right, so final video for Unit 10 has to do with respiratory control. We're going to go a little bit more into how your body makes adjustments for things like altitude and exercise as well. Respiratory control obviously occurs in the brain, but more specifically, it occurs in the centers of the brain that are almost exclusively autonomic, that you don't control. Now, you can obviously control your rate of breathing, but we don't have to. And even when we have to increase breathing for various reasons, the body kind of does that on its own. The most of the respiratory centers are found in these areas in the pons and the medulla. And you can see here the different things, the pontine and the VRG and the DRG. You don't need to know any of those things. Just to know that there's several respiratory centers found in the pons and medulla. Now, one interesting thing is these respiratory centers generate a kind of respiratory rhythm. They work together with the intercostal muscles of the ribs and with the diaphragm to produce this kind of rhythm that we're all used to when it comes to our breathing. You know, people tend to breathe at a normal rhythm that is normal for them. And the origin of this breathing rhythm is really not fully understood. They know that it rests in this parts of the brainstem, but they're not exactly sure why it does what it does. The most widely accepted hypothesis has to do with basically two interconnected pacemaker, quote unquote, pacemaker neurons, and they generate this kind of rhythm, and then they can increase the rhythm as you need more oxygen or as you need less. Say, like when you're sleeping, you tend to breathe a lot more shallow or a lot slower when you're sleeping versus like when you exercise, when you take big, deep, fast kind of breaths. And so these two places, the pons and the medulla, and the centers there in there are where respiration mostly occurs. Now, a little bit more about the rate of breathing and the depth of breathing. The depth of breathing is largely determined by how actively your respiratory centers are stimulating those respiratory muscles. The greater the stimulation, the increased depth of respiration. And rate is oftentimes determined by how long that center is active. And then based on your body's demands, if you're like working out or something like that, they then can change based on the demands. And so the most important of factors when it comes to depth and rate of inspiration are just changing levels of CO2 and O2, obviously. And then also the pH of the blood is a very important thing. We talked about that in a previous video where the pH of the blood is controlled by the amount of CO2 in the blood. If there's too much or too little CO2, then the blood can be too acidic or too basic. And so then you will breathe out more or try to breathe less. That's the idea anyway. And the levels of these chemicals are sensed by, of course, by the brain itself. And there are also sensors found and you can see that on this picture here. There are some peripheral chemoreceptors here on the aortic arch, which is right outside the heart. And then this big artery here, which is called the carotid artery, which goes straight up to the brain. The brain is going to be the biggest user of oxygen in the body per weight, and just because it needs all that energy. And so that would make sense that these receptors would be there detecting the slightest changes in order to keep the brain alive, which is a good thing, of course. Which brings us to this next idea of hyperventilation. And so hyperventilation is basically the idea that you are increasing the depth and rate of your breathing, which exceeds the body's need to remove CO2. If the body can't, or if the body is getting rid of too much CO2, it's called hyperventilation or too much breathing, if you just want to think of it simply. A lot of times this can occur without the person even really realizing it. Usually this hyperventilation is associated with anxiety. And so a person can be experiencing anxiety subconsciously and not really know it. And you don't really realize what's going on until you start to experience the symptoms of hyperventilation. As you have decreased CO2 in the blood, it's going to cause some certain symptoms. You're going to there's going to be cerebral vasoconstriction. Your brain is trying to doesn't want all that blood that's in there, right? Because it's trying to save itself, and so what this is going to result in dizziness. You could even faint. You may have spasms in your hands, like your hands feel numb, or maybe like one side of your face will drop or feel numb, and it's just because of this too much or not enough CO2 in the blood, which changes the blood's acidity, which also changes the blood's ability to take in oxygen, which is not good. And so the treatment for this is really simple. I know that there's probably several of you that have experienced this kind of thing, and a lot of times what this can lead to is something called a panic attack, which a panic attack is basically where this is a never-ending cycle, right? You experience anxiety, causes you to feel lightheaded, you think you're dying, you experience anxiety, and there's just this never-ending cycle. And the best thing to do is just to pick up a bag and breathe into it. Because what does that do? Well, it causes you to put CO2 into the bag, and then you breathe that air right back in, which increases the CO2 in your blood, which causes everything to miraculously get better. It's pretty incredible that a simple treatment like that would work, but it does. It's pretty incredible. And so if you ever have this trouble, just pick up a bag and breathe into it. All right, so let's talk about how the body makes adjustments for exercise. That kid there is getting big in the squats. Actually, it looks like he's about to lose that weight. But anyway, so basically during exercise, dependent upon the intensity and the duration of the exercise, adjustments have to be made. And so ventilation or breathing can actually increase 10 to 20 times the normal rate. And it can increase abruptly and then kind of increase gradually until it reaches this steady kind of state. And then when exercise stops, you have an abrupt decline again, and then you have this gradual decrease. You've all probably experienced this at some level. If you just took off running, you would have this really increase, and then it would take a minute for it to kind of equalize. And then if you stop, you have a really quick decrease, and then it takes a minute for that to equalize as well. One other thing that's fascinating about exercise is that, and it's been studied a bunch, is that as the body changes its rate of breathing, things like the partial pressure of oxygen, CO2, pH of the blood, these things remain relatively constant as long as you're a healthy person. And what happens is, as you get in more shape, the body's ability to use the oxygen that's available to it increases. And so your rate of breathing will also decrease or it takes more work for you to get breathing as hard. And we've all experienced this. If you've ever been in a sport or something like that, and you practice, and the first practices suck, and then after that they get better because you're just getting more shape. Before we go to that, an interesting thing about exercise too is you can actually increase your ventilation just with the psychological stimulus of anticipating exercise, which I thought that was pretty cool. Not only is it a stimulus from like your skeletal muscles, your respiratory centers, and we talked about muscles, remember the proprioceptors, the things that are keeping you kind of balanced, and all those the tendons and all those things working together. Those things are obviously going to do that, but even just the psychological stimuli will cause you to, increase your breathing as you get ready to. And then as you feel the exercise nearing an end, you will actually start to slow down for the same reasons that you sped up. I just thought that was interesting. All right, so next is this idea of altitude and how that can affect your oxygen levels. As you see here, as you go up the mountain, the amount of oxygen available in the atmosphere decreases significantly. So then the partial pressure of oxygen goes down, so the oxygen's ability to get into your blood is going to decrease significantly. And so this can trigger symptoms of something called acute mountain sickness, or sometimes you'll see this called altitude sickness. Basically, the atmospheric pressure goes way down. And so all those other things are going to go way down as well. This can lead to lots of stuff: headaches, shortness of breath, nausea, dizziness. And in severe cases, it can lead to death. can cause the lungs to not do the work, and so you can die of this. And typically, when people climb really tall mountains, they do this system of acclimatization. You can't just decide today that you're going to climb Mount Everest and do it. It takes a while for you to acclimatize yourself to the different altitudes to get ready for that. And then you'll get to another camp and you'll stay there for a few days in order to acclimatize before you make the summit. And then even as you get to the summit, you can only be there for a certain amount of time. And a lot of times what happens is people will stay too long at the summit, and then as they're going back down, they'll get sick and or worse as they come back down the mountain because they didn't realize that their body was so deprived of oxygen. And a lot of times what people will do is they will just take oxygen tanks with them to the summit in order to kind of counteract this. But still, because the atmospheric pressure is so low, it does tricks with your lungs. And so the best thing is to acclimatize. If you've ever moved to a higher altitude area or moved from high altitude to low altitude, you probably immediately felt this. Or if you've ever taken a vacation in a high altitude area, you've noticed this too. It can drastically affect just your ability to just walk to the car, to walk across the parking lot. It really changes your whole body's physiology. And so it's very important to kind of acclimatize yourself to those changes, just like it is with exercise.